everybody. I am delighted that, well, I'm Alex Shakow, and on behalf of the USAID Alumni Association and of DACOR, we welcome you here today. It's wonderful to have such a great turnout, considering that it is not only August 1st, when presumably everybody has left town, but beyond that, you have to worry about coming into town because of the metro. So I'm deeply grateful that you have done that, and that I'm sure it'll pay off for you by the delightful and interesting presentation that we have here from Sam Worthington. One additional announcement is that Sam was talking earlier about being at Bellagio and working on some writing and things at the Rockefeller Center, which reminded me that on September 20th, not here at DACOR, but at IFPRI on K Street, that we will hear from Gordon Conway, who was the president of the Rockefeller Foundation for about 6 years, I think, in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And he's now at Imperial College, but he's going to be talking, he's been very much involved on food issues and I always want to say HMOs, but it's GMO, right? Anyway, I urge you all to attend that. It's going to be interesting, and it's a new development. And we're not deserting you, Christine, and we want our DACOR relationship to continue, but it's delightful on that busy week that DACOR has its annual meeting and lots going on here, and it wasn't convenient to meet here, so we're doing this jointly with IFPRI, which is a nice collaboration for us as well. You have before you, where you're sitting on it, the text of Sam Worthington's very illustrious background. Let me just say that he is a terrific spokesman on behalf of this ever-growing and ever more important NGO community, and having run himself for about, is it 8 years or more, SAVE, which is a very large and important NGO, he has been, for the last 10 years or so, been leading Interaction. And I think most of you know that Interaction is this organization that's kind of an umbrella group on behalf of now over 180 members, which is quite remarkable. I was trying to dig into my own files and see if I could figure out what the number of members were in the early days, but it's certainly grown, I'm sure, by leaps and bounds, and its importance and significance in this town, where it really does play a very strong leadership role, is immense, and very important in terms of the work of USAID and the work of the development community in general, both in terms of its advocacy work and its support work to these very large numbers of organizations of varying size and significance. So, Sam Worthington, we are delighted that you are here in face of all these other problems. I know you're traveling quite a lot, and so we're glad we could squeeze you into here on the 1st of August, but thank you very, very much for coming.
And thank you all for coming out on another warm summer day. And I really appreciate this opportunity to address all of you. I don't know if I'm going to say things that you don't know, but hopefully I can give you a perspective of the world coming from non-state actors. As you know, the NGO sector has been one of USAID's most long-standing partners. And the partnership between the two sides of the American people, that which is publicly funded and that which is privately funded, goes way back. But we are probably in one of the more challenging phases of our existence. So there are some core existential questions being asked. What is the role of a Northern NGO? Should we exist? How can we have greater collective impact? What is our role vis-a-vis the nation state? And do we have a long-term legitimacy in today's world? And these questions are being examined not just by Interaction, with about 55 staff, 42 working groups on different topics, but our 200 plus members and partners. We see ourselves as an active player of Northern civil society, this term that's emerged of civic actors, but we are a coordinator of that as a subgroup of actors, with members involved in all thematic areas that you can imagine. To give you a sense of what it means to be an NGO in 2016, our largest members are over $1 billion a year. Our smallest are five staff. We have that whole range. The collective of interaction manages $18 billion a year of resources. Interestingly, the US government is under 24% of that. So the center of gravity of the US NGO sector is the American public, corporations, foundations, not the institutions that you used to work for. We are collectively the 4th largest donor in the world. So this is a different sort of mind of this is as rather than an extension of the US government, and that partnership is critical. As a development actor in our own right, we found that our members work with some 800 corporations, and only about half of our members actually work with the US government. So when I look to the future, I was looking at this a bit and reflecting in this beautiful place called Bellagio. I see 6 areas where we will be around for decades. The first is we have a legitimacy to educate and influence the American public. NGOs spend hundreds of millions of dollars talking to the American public about global development issues. We also have a legitimacy in influencing your former employers as part of American civil society. We influence Congress, State Department, AIG, other actors, and do so as American citizens. What we're known for is implementing programs. Those niches in the world are going to change, but in fragile and conflict environments, the role of non-state actors of anything is increasing. And the dependence of state on non-state actors is increasing those environments. And also in places where extreme inequality exists in state, we'll continue to find NGOs playing a role. But there are 3 newer areas of sort of future legitimacy. The first is we are actively building a broad global civil society infrastructure. As corporations have gone global, nation states are operating on a global stage, civic actors have built infrastructures that now span the globe and play a broad range of roles across borders. So one role for us is actively building that infrastructure. A second role is sadly defending that infrastructure in the space of civil society from nation states. So it is an active engagement group of civicists and others on trying to protect the ability of civic actors in different states to exist. And the last role is increasingly central to our existence and is influencing the evolution of global capitalism and markets. So it's rubbing shoulders with major corporations and how they evolve over time. We're doing this in a massively changing landscape. Sadly, we still live in a world where most of the American population, people don't understand that we've seen such tremendous achievements in global development, from child survival to literacy to hunger. But resting on our laurels is not enough. We're seeing a world, in essence, perhaps to simplify it, of we live in the best of times, the worst of times, of 2 potential realities out there. One is of functioning nation states, perhaps high degrees of inequality, but where the state and the private sector are creating jobs, governing, are lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. There are people left behind, there are problems and so forth, but the drivers of development are quite clear. There's a clear role for civil society in those environments, but it is oftentimes more local. There is another reality. By 2020, half of the world's most extremely poor people will live in fragile, failed states. The ability to function in those environments, to create jobs, to, in essence, achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of eliminating extreme poverty In many ways, that part of the world, and I'm simplifying greatly here, will be the Achilles heel of large development efforts. Our role has shifted towards one of building capacity, towards one of leveraging, towards one of bridging private sector, state actors, and local civil society, focusing increasingly on jobs and increasingly on inequities in societies. So what's changing in this landscape? Some of you know this very well. The primary thing is perhaps the rise of local resources, trillions of dollars available in local economies. Development is not about what happens in cooperation between states, it's what happens locally. That shift of resources has enabled development to increasingly become local. The other shift of resources is you're seeing development cooperation, official aid. I think the latest data for the US is of the flow of resources leaving the United States into the developing world, official aid is 11%. The NGO community and private aid flows are roughly the same as official aid flows. They then have direct foreign investments, remittances, universities, faith-based groups, and so forth, foundations, all investing in this space. So you end up with a very different landscape where there isn't a dominant actor, and the ability to leverage each other's resources and each other's purposes and missions becomes preeminent. This is fundamentally changing how AID is working, but also changing NGOs. We're not looking for how do you do some small program here, but rather if you're putting $1.4 billion of NGO money in food security, how do you mirror that with Feed the Future, or how do you leverage different actors to get some degree of scale? But in this environment, we're having to reassess our role. One primary reason is actually an interesting business term, disintermediation. You can now give money on your cell phone through an SMS card to people in Tanzania. You don't need an NGO in between. You can get online and give directly to almost any local actor in civil society. So why give to an NGO? The NGO would have to drive its overhead rate to zero without having some argument of adding value here. So is it technical expertise? Is it a capacity to bring scale? Each NGO is now finding itself having to explain why it exists as an intermediary in a world that is quite actively disintermediating that process. Interestingly, larger NGOs are finding new roles, they're finding new ways of getting scale within this, and in many ways the sector actually continues to thrive. The other frame is we are obviously a subset of the global development community, human rights community, democracy community. We operate under the frame of the Sustainable Development Goals, the latest framework coming out of Istanbul in the World Humanitarian Summit, or COP21. These private resources of the NGO community increasingly align themselves with these broader frames. So they're not just independently sort of going all over the place, but the NGOs, private sector, other actors are grouping themselves around different thematic areas, largely set by nation states. Yet you have this other challenge of role. If development is ultimately local and it's about local actors, shouldn't our job be to, in essence, sort of work ourselves out of a job? To some extent, this is an AID mantra. You exist to enable local capacity so that they can take care of themselves. Well, as a non-state actor, our answer is actually we don't exist to work ourselves out of a job. We exist to create stronger linkages between civil society, and those linkages may change. So Interaction members BRAC, or Interaction members ADESO, one from Bangladesh, one from Kenya. There should be a future where the ADESOs and the BRACs of this world are working in the south side of Chicago and are working to help a future Katrina. We're looking at an infrastructure both of knowledge exchange, south-north, north-south, but also across the global south. And there's a broad dialogue on what does that infrastructure look like? Can international NGOs that are increasingly going global and local so that you end up with the head of World Vision Ugandan, being a Ugandan with the Ugandan board, but you're part of the World Vision brand. You have the same thing with CARE Peru, Peruvian board, Peruvian executive, part of CARE. Those infrastructures are increasingly have pressures to be flatter and to look less at resources transfers north-south and more at knowledge exchanges, leveraging capacity across different countries. One area where we don't see ourselves going away anytime soon is in the humanitarian space, though that space is changing with broader concepts of resilience. An example of this was the Ebola crisis. No nation state wanted their staff on the front lines. U.S. military came in, built a nice center to treat NGO staff and local staff who might get Ebola. Save the Children found itself in the interesting situation of being asked to host, I guess it was an example of a nation state putting people on the front line, but to host 100 human doctors. So you end up with massive demands on the NGO sector to get scale. Unfortunately, there was one NGO getting wheat into Aleppo, and with the closure of that road, wheat is no longer getting into the rebel areas of Aleppo, but in essence, the flow of food into northern Syria was largely being managed by one very large NGO. So key roles in these spaces, and if anything, demands from nation states going up, and there certainly is no shortage of resources. Perhaps the biggest area has been our sort of engagement with the private sector and this concept of sort of leveraging each other. I mentioned food security. We did a $1.5 billion pledge from Secretary Clinton. We're about to do a pledge at the September summit. I don't know how large it will be, but it's attempts to take the NGO investments and rationalize them within a framework and see if we could align and leverage each other. The U.S. government is having great difficulty figuring this out because we are an implementing partner, we compete for resources, we bid, we try, but at the same time you're a donor, how could you be both? You don't behave like both. Well, wait a second, you actually did spend $600 million on this in a way and reported using a G7 format back to the G7. So you're getting NGOs playing a confused role where it is difficult for states to figure out how to leverage them. Can you leverage the $100 million that World Vision is putting in basic education in Africa? And to what extent is that being matched by not AID, not World Vision matching AID, but the other way around? To what extent are these things part of partnerships? We have found it much easier, actually, in this arena to work with the private sector. They don't see us in this role, so you end up with private sector actors going after markets in Africa and forming partnerships with major NGOs, knowing that when they sell their product, if they're successful in getting that education market, that a portion of the sales of that product will actually then go to the NGO, not as a charitable contribution, but as part of a business transaction. So you find, I was in a room with a lot of major NGO CEOs, major US corporations. First question from the NGOs, are you here for charitable purposes, or are you here to make money? And if you're not here to make money, then we're not that interested in actually having a dialogue. We're interested in your value chains, how your value chains evolve, what is our role in relating to your value chains, and is there an overlap between your goals that have a social purpose around your ability to make money. Examples of this, Heifer International has a partnership with Bill Gates Foundation. They now run about 20% of the Kenyan milk market, to give you a sense of the sort of building of scale at the cooperative level. Habitat for Humanity, you know, for building houses, they're actually going for scale in mortgage markets. They had investments and capacity to invest $50 million of Habitat money, partnered with OPIC and a major bank to create mortgage markets for urban poor. Mercy Corps now has a fully licensed commercial bank as one of its entities. I think Mercy Corps now has 32 separate legal entities underneath it. of which half are for-profit. So you're seeing NGOs morphing into roles that are very distinct from traditional ones. With the U.S. government, I think our challenge, I've already mentioned this how do we get away from this sort of where we're advocates, we play a role for the American people, but as a donor-recipient model. Two, we're coming to the table with resources, but it's not going to be used the way a typical donor will use those resources. Is there space for that? We did an MOU with AID and food security, 33 of our members. We're still figuring out how to effectively leverage each other with a whole range of 8 rules getting in the way. Some of the new initiative labs, development initiative labs are helping a little bit in that regard. As global players, the NGOs are continuing to get bigger. A number of our members globally are then part of families around the world. World Vision globally is 53,000 people, to give you a sense of the scale of that infrastructure. When Pakistan wanted to kick out the Save the Children expat staff, they were told that, well, there was actually no one to kick out because there were no expats who Save the Children in Pakistan, but there were 1,800 Pakistanis, and if you wanted to talk to the ministry focusing on children, you could shut down their entire program dealing with children in large parts of the country. So you end up with NGOs playing interesting roles with nation states who view us through a traditional lens of you're northern actors working someplace rather than you're a large local actor with alliances in the north. We see ourselves, we have a funny term coming out of the French of NGO diplomacy. When the G7 meets, in all of the G7 countries, the umbrella organizations of the G7 of the NGOs have already met, have already discussed the agenda, are already talking to diplomats about potential agenda, are looking for what type of breakthroughs they'll have in one country. Can they get an echo in another country? We are playing the diplomatic system, in essence, underneath it, in a wide range of arenas. There are now 84 umbrella organizations around the world. Interaction plays a convening and coordinating role of a lot of these, whether it's aboiut in Brazil or Bani in India. One of the biggest challenges these groups are feeling is the nation state squeezing their ability to function. So that takes up an enormous amount of time, which gets to the civil society space issue. Obviously, we need to be regulated. We are regulated in this country, but the regulations are moving from there's a space conceptually for civic actors to we are controlling them, shutting them down. And this is not just democracy and human rights groups, but it's the ability to have a health clinic in partnership with the Ministry of Health. So you're finding this, and they have clued in that we're putting tens of millions of dollars into their country, funding their civil society, and so you then get laws, Russia, Egypt, others, of this is foreign interference coming into your country. So we're in a globalized world. The US NGO sector is globalizing itself. We are increasingly funded by sources other than nation states. We are in a market of ideas, oftentimes leveraging private sector, state, and other actors. We find ourselves pushed into arenas, often against our will. Ebola was an example. The US NGOs did not want to go there. Large pressure from the US government to take that space. Finding tremendous resources in certain places. Our relationship with civil society actors from the Global South is changing very rapidly. But within the frame I gave, I think we're going to be around for generations to come. And I am not focused that most on it, but without the relationship we have with USAID and the State Department and the US government, the conceptual framework, the strategy around which we organize ourselves will not nearly be as strong. So when we go on Capitol Hill, we'll say we're putting in X billion dollars into this area. Support us, not because we're trying to get the US government to match resources and Interaction doesn't care about the resources of our members, but because without the strategic knowledge, framing, and capacity of the US government, these charitable contributions to the American people would not have the impact they have, and so we need you. So with that, I'll stop and open it to any questions.
Thank you very much, Sam. Okay, the floor is open, so Sam, why don't you manage the question?
Kirby Rosenthal. I'm going to ask you an absolutely unanswerable question. In the old days, when AID used to be the development agency, underlying development, and the NGOs were the humanitarian agency, is there any way of making this distinction clearer, which is impossible, as one way of making a distinction between what the NGOs should do and AID, which is impossible? But your discussion, you do so much and AID does so much, but that's one area that I do think neither aid nor the NGO community has clarified what it wants to do or what it should do.
And what's been interesting about that question is it's now become a sort of existential challenge within the NGO community and within AID. So humanitarians, you're impartial, you are independent, you're run by a whole range of international humanitarian law principles that give you the right to function in Yemen or in Afghanistan or in Syria. And increasingly, every year we read out the names of staff members killed from the NGO community. We have a wall in our office, and it's between 20 and 40 staff members of the NGO sector are killed every year. The idea that there is a space for humanitarian actors is primarily being challenged by non-state actors, but these are Saudi bombs, bombs of the U.S. from the Saudis hitting hospitals in Yemen, and Russian bombs hitting NGO-led hospitals in Syria. So the squeezing of that space has been very difficult. The challenge is actually, can we, if we are functioning in humanitarian environments for decades, is the 1 year put your finger in the dike way of solving things the way to approach this? And the answer is yes, you still need to save lives, but are there things that can be done in Somalia long-term to create better markets, or to, can we help with these longer-term goals? I don't know if NGOs can do this. I know, for example, in Haiti, we promised way too much after the earthquake, the idea of building back better. Maybe in 50 years you could get a building back process, but are you looking at this in a long-term development lens, even as you're doing short-term interventions? So I think the answer to your question is those two arenas are increasingly blurring, and one of the big outcomes of the World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul was talking about the nexus of development and humanitarian work. I do draw a distinction that the NGO community is like saying business community. It's one of these really broad things. There are parts of our community that are incredibly aligned with the U.S. government, or an extension of the U.S. government's work in Afghanistan and other places. I think that gives us somewhat of a disservice. If you get too close to a nation state, you do not have the ability to function and the flexibility you have if you are more independent. We have other members, half our members don't take U.S. government money, and so we have a sort of continuum. I tend to fall sort of in the Catholic Relief Services type space. I'm not Catholic, but in the, yes, we work with the U.S. government, but. So when some proposed vetting rules were put out in Afghanistan, the NGOs turned down $100 million and walked from working with USAID. So there are times when you decide, we're just not going to take U.S. government money. In a world where AID is no longer the dominant funder of the NGO sector, I wouldn't say that's easy to do, but you can work with other governments or find other sources. So there is this sort of principled space, but we ourselves have blurred that for so long that I think it's difficult to go back to it. I don't know if I answered the question, but took a stab at it. So I saw someone up front here, I can go up there.
I gathered that so much of your own work has to do with diplomacy and communication and so forth. And I just wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more. You mentioned memorandum of understanding. That's obviously one tool that can be used to make private-public partnerships. And on the other hand, you must be communicating regularly with your members. And so I'm just wondering if you might say a little bit more about what the instruments are and how it works.
So the way we operate, Interaction is quite small, it's 55 staff, 42 working groups. I think last count was 800 to 900 people in those working groups. So our members are doing our work. What we do is provide a certain framework for them to do that. If you want to influence the Secretary of State or someone senior in the US government, 1 page, 3 points, that's it. And I know you're 50 organizations and you have 10 days. Or you're going to make a statement at the UN, you're doing a pledge, $522 million for Haiti, 1 page, 3 points, and let's get that from the US, the French NGOs, the Haitian NGOs, and 12 other countries, and you have 2 weeks to do that. We have found an ability to pull together some very sharp, it's not about every single NGO wish, but Interaction has been given the authority by our members to veto things, to say, well, this is nonsense, we're not going to send this to anyone, it doesn't really say anything, or to force them to some degree of conclusion, and when a call needs to be made, to make that call. To do that right is an interesting diplomatic act. So one time I'm away to Save the Children, another time it's Oxfam or World Vision or Catholic Relief Services, but we're doing it within a strategic frame that they have set for us. So we have an ability, we're not about the lowest common denominator of the NGO sector, but rather an expression about mission and interest of the collective, ultimately as judged by the executive of Interaction. Having said that, if I am foolish enough to judge that wrong too many times, you get in trouble. I've been at it for 10 years, so it's obviously a political dance. So there's the internal political dance of what's possible. Then there's the external of who can you influence under what terms. And a lot of that, like I presume in any diplomatic arena, is relationships. So when there's a problem, go back to Haiti with the French NGOs in Haiti, let me call the head of the umbrella of Coordination Sud in France and say, why on earth are you doing this? Can we stop fighting? Or if a group of US NGOs have decided to take on food security and take it on each other in the media, you know, I could send a letter to 11 CEOs saying cease and desist, and they cease and desist. I will then annoy all 11 because each is convinced that their side will win. But that ability to use us as a tool, as a diplomatic tool, is the intent of the CEOs. They know that collectively they could do things individually or in small groups. They also know that collectively they can achieve things that they can't do without us, as long as there is an integrity to the process of what we're doing and there's a certain amount of transparency in that. I spend an enormous amount of time now actually dealing with our foreign counterparts. You know, what is our relationship with the NGO umbrella groups in India? Not because it's that relevant for our day-to-day right now, but we find that when you have something on the G20 or others, to be able to call on the Indian NGO sector to align with us is something that is highly relevant. Or if there's a problem in a particular country, we could then have a relationship because they have a better relationship with their governments better than we do. This is still a Western-dominated infrastructure, largely because the Western governments are the ones that are more comfortable with these types of civic actors. So obviously how it relates to Coordination Sud in France or Bond in the UK or Venro in Germany, those relationships are mirror to some extent our own government's relationships with Western Europe. Same thing with Japan, long-term relationship with the NGO sector in Japan. We try to emulate each other. We try to learn from each other. As the US, we're the largest, biggest, but we always say we're not the US government. You take your positions first, we'll come in behind you, and we find we're inevitably in the room shaping the final documents for what the NGOs want to do.
Hi, really appreciate your presentation, which has probably confused all of us because it's a much more dynamic situation than we're used to, I think, in our old thoughts about NGOs. Two quick questions. First, what's the health of the NGO sector? You sort of look at the whole American NGO sector. the big getting bigger, the small fading away. I was on a board of an organization that went out of business, essentially. How is that moving? And secondly, within sectors, for example, the Paris Environment Climate Change Agreement, do you take a role in that, trying to aggregate environmental organizations and positions? I know that's hard to do. Most Global Health Council faded away. The environmental organizations, the big ones, don't come together as far as I know. How do you handle something like Paris?
Okay, so how the health of the sector overall, little interaction itself, probably about 3 times the size we were, and overall maybe 4 times the resources. In 1990, to save the children would have been 70–80% dependent on the US government, and now that's flipped. The boom of private resource investment in this sector has transformed it. Like now you're in a market. So if you have troubles in that market, you go out of business. So merger rates are about 1.4%. Merger rates in the for-profit sector are about 1.6%, so they're really not that different. The big ones aren't necessarily merging as much, but there are multiple mergers happening out there. So you have a sector about 4 times larger, multiple mergers, less dependent on the US government, but because it's market, you go out of business. So lots of new ones starting up. You could be a $100 million NGO and you play it wrong and you go under. The millennials, to some extent, are bypassing it, creating social enterprises. So you have this question of what type of legal entity will you be in the future? And yet you get the larger NGOs also getting innovation social enterprise sectors being created. That said, the big global brands are getting bigger. Because if you're Nike or whomever it is and you want to partner, having someone who's already in 120 countries of a recognized brand has the ability to absorb 150 million and handle something at scale. Those brands are getting bigger. Small, high energy at the small end. Mid-size, more dependent on USAID. Tough niche, unless it's in an area that the US government really cares about. But if it's an area that is no longer the latest development fad, your ability to survive, compete with the contractor community and others is quite difficult. So quite a bit of turnover. Do we aggregate NGOs in all spaces? And NGOs is such a broad sector, different parts of this community are better at organizing themselves than others. I spent 5+ years courting the democracy and human rights community to come into interaction. We can't come into you, your development, you'll take away from our mission. So eventually we've created a whole partnership with them. We have a joint initiative, separate staffing. They fund it all, it's under our roof, it's our staff, their brand, we give them space. We're not trying to centralize, we're trying to be a flat network. So if a subsector of the NGO community wants to organize itself and wants our assistance in organizing itself, we help them. If they don't, this is civil society, multi-headed hydra, there's not necessarily a center here. Anyone who wants to claim they are leading and controlling civil society is got a tougher job than I have. So the good news is that many parts of the sector at the leadership level want to actually figure out how to work with each other, recognize that their institutions are feeding the beast of fundraising and there are a whole range of reasons why they can't collaborate, but know that at a strategic level they must. So I'm surprised 10 years into this job about the degree of tolerance for collaboration and the degree of leadership that they actually give to us. I'll stay on the mic this time.
Sam, thank you. On this question of relationships and coordination and cooperation, a principal thrust of development cooperation these days has come to be to emphasize local ownership, local priorities, engagement of civil society within the developing country in dialogue with government and trying to support that local leadership of the development process. And I wonder how you see the role of the international NGOs, because as you say, in some cases, I think of those that I know, like Transparency, the local chapters, probably all local people. They just happen to have that umbrella and source of external knowledge and support. And if you're sitting in the agriculture ministry or the health ministry or the education ministry in a developing country, how are you're trying to get your arms around all of these different parts of a much more complicated set of actors and funding sources than we've ever seen before. And how do you see the international NGOs playing in that changing environment?
So first on the number of actors, I remember this was a good one from Haiti. There are too many NGOs in Haiti and too many local civil society groups in Haiti. And it was Bill Clinton who said there are 10,000 local civil society groups in Haiti, and that's impossible for the Haitian government. So I just did the math and divided the number of Haitian civil society groups by the Haitian population, and then compared it to the U.S. Haiti has one civil society group for every 970 Haitian. In the US, we have one civil society group for every 260 Americans. So we have 3 times as many civil society actors in this country than they do in Haiti. So the issue is, what type of society do you want? Do you want a society of lots of organized local civic groups, or groups that are nicely controlled? Our argument is that you want lots of local civil society groups, but those local civil society groups need to know how to organize themselves and contribute to a Ministry of Education. So we were with the French and the Indians and the Brazils and others created something called the International Federation of NGO Platforms, which are umbrella groups in some 80 countries. Civicus is another example. I'm just stepping down from their board after 6 years. One big role we have is trying to help local civic actors play the role we play with our own government, play the same role with their government. There's a maturing of the civic sector from just an opposition role when we don't like what our government is doing to how do we help you solve this problem, and by the way, we have a greater orientation on human well-being or on rights or justice or whatever it is. And that dialogue with Southern civil society groups is a very dynamic one of what does it mean to be an inside player in a nation state that is functioning. So we have a role in funding that. I have found that with private resources, you could do more. You'll go in for 10 to 15 years partnership with local civil society groups, and you're committing for that long. There's no rebidding, you are building a capacity of some institutions for some long term, whether it's cooperatives related to the private sector or other civil society groups. Where we veer off course is when we, as an extension of a delivery stream of resources, become contractor-like and say, here are the rules. And I know I was with Plan International, and when I left, I think we were about $650 million a year. AID was about 5%. But we were really good at making sure that those local groups followed our accounting rules, and they could, recite our accounting rules back at us from the base. So the dynamics of what do you do with the power of money, how do you change that? That power isn't going to change, but if you shift the power so that it is Plan India managing that money versus Plan International managing it, you're at least making it much more local. But in the long run, it is a vision of a civil society not that dissimilar from the private sector. Small little groups, big organized local groups, and multinationals all within a market. To be legitimate as a multinational civil society actor in a state, you have to have gone local. The fact that you can take ideas, knowledge from your local brand is a great advantage. But we must spend time, and we just spent time, encouraging AID forward, spend 30% of your resources locally, something we supported. Pushing for 20% of resources from humanitarian resource spent directly to local groups. We don't exist to simply be an intermediary for the sake of resources. Let's be candid. Of course, organizations want to grow, want to have resources, but as interaction, our mandate is not to help them on that. Our mandate is actually to push their better selves forward. So I think it's helping local civil society mature and spending the resources. By mature, I mean we have the same problem. I'm not saying that in a patronizing way. We as civil society tend to take great stances that are correct, right, based on law, and add absolutely no value to the person sitting in the government. And those positions are of the street. You need street pressure, so forth. But we're interested in building the part of civil society that is figuring out how to change a value chain of a major corporation versus figuring out how to help an industry. So there's a broad evolutionary process underway.
Sam, as governance junkies, I think we have a particular appreciation of the real transformational leadership. Thank you so much for telling us what you've been doing at Interaction. And thank you for talking about the attacks on civil society, which are extremely worrisome and a kind of a leading indicator of deterioration in government that I think, in my view, the United Nations and national governments have been far too silent about. And even the UN is beginning to restrict the space for some civil society actions, maybe seeing it as a trend. I wanted to ask you, the rumor has it there's an election coming, and I wanted to kind of get your, I have a sense about one party might be doing on this because they have more of a track record, but I have no sense at all of the other. But what sense do you make of what the future of international development will be under either candidate, should either one?
So before I get that, just a little civil society space. I was pleased that 2 years ago we, our lawsuit against the U.S. government that went to the Supreme Court that we won. This was on a freedom of speech for NGO sector. If we receive money from the U.S. government, can the U.S. government tell us what policies to have with our private resources? And the Supreme Court said no. What was interesting is the coalition to pull that together was a left-right coalition, and it was left-right voting in the Supreme Court. So when we talk about civic space, we're talking about civic space everywhere. So the good news, in any future administration, we will still have the right to have our views, which is good news. This is one of the more frustrating transitions. We have staff from former Republican, other staffers on Hill. We have a very bipartisan sort of engagement with Capitol Hill. We couldn't have helped the passage, encouraged the passage of the Global Food Security Act had we not had that ability to work across the aisle. We have members that are strongly in the evangelical community, and in many ways I describe us as an American movement that, unlike some of our European counterparts, actually does span the entire political spectrum. Our challenge with this election is there's no there to talk to the Trump team. So, okay, let's go talk to the RNC and work with them, but there isn't a dialogue, and many of the leading development professionals who are Republican in Washington have distanced themselves from either broken relations or distanced themselves. So if you know of someone we should be talking to that happens to be in the Trump camp, we will gladly talk to them. I think the Clinton community is a different one. I don't know how many staff members we'll lose to the administration. We've already done a lot of that under Obama. In that case, I think it will, I wouldn't say business as usual, in that Secretary Clinton knows development far better than President Obama. She's going to have things that she will want to push. But we've seen big changes just in the change of an AID administrator. Gail Smith coming in, much more focused on democracy, rights, fragile states than under Raj Shah. Raj Shah, much more comfortable, more of a technocratic focus on coming out of his experience with Gates and others. So just who that person is has a tremendous role given the independence of I don't see development, diplomacy, and defense being taken apart. I see development still at the table in either administration. But your guess as to what a Trump foreign policy will look like is probably as good as mine. And being a civil society person who's focused on optimism, I probably would rather not go So I don't know. Thanks.
I said, let me add my thanks as well. You've talked a bit about Haiti, given it as an example a number of times, and I know that you personally in interaction more generally played an important role early on with trying to improve coordination among the NGO actors. But I'm wondering if, kind of in retrospect, whether you have kind of lessons learned that you sort of could share, and the degree to which you think a better job was done in Nepal from learning on those, or are there still important lessons that we all need to learn and do a better job?
So I think the UN system learned some good lessons through the transformative agenda that Valerie Amos put in as the emergency coordinator for the UN. We worked very closely with her to tweak the system of which we're part of. The first lesson is that Haiti is not normal. Most big disasters don't have enough NGOs there. Go to CAR, go to Yemen, parts of DRC. The messy places on earth do not tend to be invaded by a whole bunch of people trying to help them. That is an exception. Most emergencies are complex emergencies with some form of violence associated with them, where non-state actors, if you are operating those environments, you have to know what you're doing. So to some extent, Haiti is an exception. Where it is more normal, when you get to a natural disaster that is getting the world's focus, do resources flow into this? The big distinction in our mind is we have to be careful what you promise. We could help save lives, we could improve schools, we could have improved infant mortality rates, we could stop the spread of the cholera pandemic. As non-state actors, we cannot help a country govern themselves better. We can't, in essence, create a new Haiti. I don't think civil society can play that role. I think another lesson in Haiti, the first meeting with the Haitian government, with Haitian civil society was in March. Interestingly organized by UNDP and Interaction. It took outside actors to actually convince the Haitian government to meet with its own civil society. That was the one and only meeting that actually happened to have a dialogue. When you don't trust your people or how your people are organized, very difficult for an outside actor to figure out how to play a constructive role. Philippines, very different picture with Hayan coming in. Very close working relationship with the Filipino government. Our preference is have a government in control that is managing this, that you're part of a broader effort where someone is guiding it, and that is what functions best in natural disasters, in the complex emergencies, and that's where we're really trying to figure out involve our role, particularly on how do we help the private sector in some ways with job creation in those environments. So a little bit of humility would have helped. Stepping back, I think President Clinton did a disservice by saying, we're going to build back better, and we'll, by all coming in, you will do this. A government that is willing to accept its own civic actors, and longer term experiments. I mean, you have a large U.S. NGO in Eastern Congo, DRC, where if you go to the government office, you meet someone who is of the government, but you go into the back room, and it's an NGO running the government. So the operations of the government have been outsourced, but not outsourced to the NGO elsewhere, but the NGO is embedded in the government providing support. So these are, again, more complex roles to play. I remember meeting with President Craval a number of times, and he was giving us a very hard time. We have no idea where you're working. And I said, well, actually, I think I could do that. He said, prove it. I said, okay, get the top 10 NGO country directors in here tomorrow, and I want you to prove it. And so we came in, top major country directors of US NGOs, pulled out a map of Haiti, had coordinates of where all the NGOs were working, what projects they were doing, which was all managed by the Ministry of Planning of Haiti, all of whom were killed. So the Haitian government knew exactly where the NGOs were working, what they were doing, and so forth. But without the planning, coordinating capacity, we can't provide that extra way. So those are a little few lessons. So we'll go here and here, or go back.
So I wanted to follow up.
just been, I just want to follow up on two of the disasters
Okay.
that you do.
Follow up the
about.
disasters.
One is Nepal, because I was there.
The microphone, Bobby,
Sorry.
if you're gonna.
Okay, the reason I broke in now is because I sat here and listened to Haiti, and anyway, I was in Nepal on the date of the first anniversary of their earthquake and wondered if you had any comments on that. And also having worked on the Build Back Better when Hurricane Mitch hit Central America, I'm wondering whether you had any comments about, I think some people I know felt that some of those things worked in the case of Central America, but
I think that we, in most circumstances, get natural disasters right. The UN system actually functions quite well. The NGOs fall into roles they should play. If you've got a decent functioning government, they step back because they don't have the capacity, and then they slowly step back in, and there's sort of a handoff. I remember seeing this. I did an evaluation for President Clinton of the tsunami in Aceh, in Sri Lanka, India. I remember being in Honduras after Mitch and watching, cars through 6-story windows in Tegucigalpa, and a partnership that plan had with the government rebuilding the community. So we have largely, I think that's not the biggest problem we face. We face it if it's in a state that is not functioning well, which is many places. Nepal, hindered by the fact that India sort of was playing power politics on access to airports during this whole time, the ability of how much are you rebuilding where, and you ended up with a massive bottleneck in Kathmandu of not being able to do that, get goods in, and then the world doesn't care anymore and moves on. So you've got this relatively short window to get lots of things in. The Red Cross gets in trouble for spanning things 5 years out, whereas everyone in the development community is saying, this is a 10, 15-year rebuilding process. Let's take that initial money and stretch it as far as we can go, because we know that the world eventually will look the other way. I remain relatively optimistic about the system that is in place on natural disasters.
Yes, I would just like to add my appreciation to your comments and what you've provided us. My question is more in the public relations area. I think many of the questions that were raised here, you've attempted to answer very well, as much as you can, in a very constrained time. But do you have a website where we could go to and see, for example, your mission statement, particularly on the scope of your involvement around the world? And then I ask this question very guardedly. Anything to evaluate your program? I realize it's quite different than we in the development field we have these fairly rigid and structured evaluations. The fact that you're dealing with different populations, it would be different, but yet testimonials, what has worked, where it has worked, what hasn't, those are the questions I think many of us would like to delve down deeper into. Thank you.
Good question. You sound like our evaluation team and my board, which is good. Which one person who's actually been on it. A good place to go, which is actually not our website, but is an interaction website, is called NGOA Map. Because one of the questions people go is, I have no idea where you're working. We have now mapped $14 billion, NGOAidmap.org. We have now mapped $14 billion of NGO projects. I think we have 5 billion live. So if you want to know and click on a country where NGO X is spending $100,000 or $10 million with whatever money, what their population they're trying to reach, what their goals are of that project, we have now are getting live data updated every 6 months from members going into that database, which is now geocoded on a map. So this is the largest sort of transparency exercise of the NGO sector. Part of it came out of Haiti. I remember sitting next to a colleague at the State Department on NPR, and we were both being blasted roughly in the same way. And it was sort of, well, who are you, where are you, what are you doing, how are you working? And Save the Children could tell you that, but they're going, no, each of you NGOs, it's not you, it's the collective. And so we have had to step back and create data get data from our members for the collective to present to governments, so that if you're in Ghana and it's in food security, you know that some 17 or $18 million of NGO money is going into Ghana in food security, and where is it going? So that if you sit down with someone, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf in Liberia with her cabinet, and she could know on an off-budget way where the NGO money is going. We're not going to run it through you, but we will be a responsible development actor with the nation state that is responsible. Interaction itself, evaluations from our board and so forth. We have a very large monitoring and evaluation working group. It tends to partner with Harvard, IEEE, Duke, others on a sort of debate over what type of evaluations. What you're asking for is sort of the meta evaluation of the collective. We, if I go then to interaction, we have actually reduced ourselves to 3 goals, a whole series of objectives that we then try to meet. Our objectives tend to be relatively grandiose, which is namely change you or your former employers in some way, and what power do we actually have over that. That said, let's give an example. The last time the U.S. was a presidency of the G8, the White House was wrestling with something to do in the development space. We came up with the idea that you could probably reduce stunting for 50 million children in the world, and that this is something the U.S. government could take on and actually pull off. All right, let's create a little pressure. Let's make sure that you have 70 or 80 organizations writing in Huffington Post, other places, all under their own brand, all pushing this idea. So you're getting it wherever you're looking at this, you've gotten all major NGOs to stop pushing their individual idea to push a collective idea. It gets taken up by the White House, Mike Froman, others, different dialogue on this, goes to G8, becomes part of the G8 agenda, but there's no money there. G8 moves to the UK. We'll put in $750 million of NGO money as a pledge against nutrition to this 50 million goal of helping 50 million children. Will you launch a pledging conference in the UK? Then a pledging conference happens, $4.2 billion eventually pledged for this, and you end up. So this is an example of an influencing role, but the one thing that we can't do is there is no direct causality. We weren't making these decisions. We were creating an enabling environment for the decisions to be made. We can create some political pressure for certain things to happen. But we have quite a few narratives, and it would be interaction.org, which is our website, that describe places where we think we've achieved something. The Global Food Security Act, $7.2 billion went through. The first 2 years we were working on that. USAID did not want us working on this. We actually wrote the act in our office, pushed it up on Capitol Hill, worked with Republicans in the House, got some traction. Finally, AID came around to, we like this. And then the land-grant university said, well, wait a second, are you writing this for the NGOs? No, we're writing it for you. Let's bring in the land-grant universities. Let's bring in Cargill, DuPont, and have a broad coalition. By this time, AID was very invested in this. And ultimately, it's now passed with bipartisan and signed by the president, the largest legislation since PEPFAR to come through the United States. So we sometimes nudge things into existence and sometimes play a secondary role. But I think how we evaluate that, we do.
Well, I think it gets back down to, I understand that evaluation would be difficult, but do you have testimonials locally that said, look, this is what you accomplished?
Yeah, we.
And is that on your website? I mean, these would be the things.
Peter, go look. Go look and find it.
No, it's interesting.
I like to quote Mike Froman saying, Sam, you made this happen, but it would be nice to, but since he did say that publicly, I can't say he ever said that.
Sam, you've done a great job, I think, of defining the incredible changes that the NGO communities had to deal with in the world environment in the last 10 or 15 years, from everything from literally how you pay people in the local community up to how you engage other actors. For those of us in this room, a lot of people work as mentors to the USAID staff and engage routinely in some fashion in our former agency. And could you comment on whether USA adapted to this requirement for this kind of agility, or what we might do as mentors to a lot of the new staff coming in to help prepare them for a world that's quite different from when many of us left it not too many years ago.
The Global Development Lab, I think, is experimenting quite well in this space. We have an interesting dialogue with them. For example, they have a whole bunch of new innovations, but how do you scale it? So let's create a dialogue of how would you scale this, not through an AID mechanism, but through mechanisms with the private sector and other actors. And could aid play a role of seed money in this? I think that one of the biggest challenge for the agency is this tension of wanting to control something in a game that is ultimately about leverage and letting go of control. And having run, plan, we were $600-700 million agency, we wanted to control things too, but that desire to avoid the risk of having it mess up on your watch and the need to actually have the different other actors involved be the primary ones who are leveraging the change is a different and difficult role. So now the question is, can the agency as a whole do this? I doubt it. Can parts of it play this role? And are there other parts, aid needs to have contracts, needs to have very concrete things done. There is, and I'm not saying that there isn't a role for the more directive way of doing this, but when aid was, ODA was 70-80% of the game out there, whereas ODA just in the US is only 11% of it. You are a minority player, and aid tends to still act as if it's the center of gravity. And I remember going to an aid mission director, this was actually sort of 16, 17 years ago, and the conversation was, well, we have no money. I said, I know that, our budget's bigger than yours. So can we have a conversation? And how do you partner with an NGO when their budget is bigger than yours? And what is the relationship and how you bring the private sector? Aid is doing this, but it is something that is a difficult evolution. Just as it's a difficult evolution for the NGO sector, who have large bureaucracies and their own desire to not have something go wrong on their own watch. So it is the challenge of moving big bureaucracies. One of the favorite words of some of our CEOs, I would say favorite word, but one of the words that comes up is, are we dinosaurs? Because they're looking at the social enterprise groups, other groups, to what extent will we be replaced by more nimble actors beneath us? I doubt it, because at least if you're part of a faith-based group, that faith is going to keep on giving to you as long as that faith exists. You're not going to disappear. But the real question is, are you still going to be as relevant in the world? And that relevancy comes through that leveraging. So I think that is going to be the tension for a new young professional within AID, is how do you manage those more complex relationships where you're not necessarily going to have as much control.
May I interrupt just for a second? Say, do you use some of that influence and try to convince people on the Hill, who are a major constraint in aid being more flexible, less controlling, and so on? Do you find any interest among the major players that you deal with on the Hill for this kind of change to reflect this very different world that you're describing?
Part of it was actually changing a little bit NGO advocacy, which is sort of evolving but not there yet. But the idea that if you are doing everything through an earmark, everything becomes a whole bunch of added up earmarks, and aid has even more earmarks than it can handle, and maybe we should add one more, and maybe we should be talking about greater local ownership, and so forth. So the narrative of the NGO sector towards the Hill has evolved. That said, the issue of desire for control over resources, over, it's about not health systems, but a disease. We have a long-term ongoing education process. Part of that we're doing is by coming in, not we need this much money for AID, but rather we're putting this much money down. Can you partner with us? Your current systems don't allow us to partner well, which is a different message, and gets people going, what do you mean? Can I help aid partner better? Well, to do that, these are the barriers that we're getting from the Hill. So the narrative has changed, but I view this as a very long-term process here.
Two quick questions. Is the Council on Foreign Relations or similar organizations in Russia and India that I know of, are they members of your group, or is it too close to being policy? And could you have weighed in on the Iraq war, this debate and discussion, and maybe saved us making a mistake?
Got it. I don't know about the power to influence to save anyone on this. Our members are all US based. We do have policy members, but I've been talking a lot about members. In terms of partnerships, we work with everyone in town. So whether it's Brookings or Aspen, or I'm actually up to Aspen tomorrow, our view is that if it's the NGOs talking to themselves, we're not accomplishing very much. So where's the private sector room, where are the think tanks in the room, if it's democracy and governance and rights, where are those people in the room? So increasingly, we try to get our own act together, what our own views, and then immediately go to a bigger group, because by ourselves, we don't have enough influence. On Iraq, I remember being in the room with some of our major members. At the time, I wasn't in this role, but was running one of them, and the collective decision to not work with the U.S. government in Iraq, and to, in essence, start at this point where we're not going to go into this war with you, and the NGO sector is not with you. It was rapidly replaced by the contractor community. So we know we're easily replaceable, but it is a sector that did, in this case, take a stand that this was going to be a mess, and we don't think we should be heading down this path. We have tended to, the real limitation of interaction is that we have tended to avoid topics that are just too hot. So get into, let's say, abortion and reproductive rights and so forth. What's interesting is having both sides within the community. When that was being used as a reason to hold up Gail Smith's nomination, you had the Catholic Church and Oxfam and World Vision and CARE coming together as, don't you dare introduce that topic into this space. We have a truce here. So there are certain things that we create, we operate within certain boundaries of the realm of where the political consensus is of this community. Those boundaries are actually quite large on peace building, on issues of justice, and so forth. They get trickier when you try to figure out, will I take on a policy thing such as war?
Thanks, Sam. This is a question about evolution, not of AID, but of your organization. It's mind-boggling what you are describing in terms of how much reach and depth that interaction activities carry out. You've got $14 billion, you said? You've got 75 or 100 sectors. I've forgotten how many members you've got, but it's a leviathan in some ways. And the idea of running all of that through collaboration rather than bureaucrocy with top-down, more, in some ways, more efficient action. I just wonder what you see as the near to medium-term change needed in your organization as you keep growing and keep taking on more and more complicated issues.
And part of this, my training came, I was the CEO of Plan US. Plan at the time had 16 separate legal entities in 62 countries. Yes, there's a global CEO, but I don't report to him. I report to my board, so how do you make it work? Mm-hmm. And so I was sort of like your NATO coming together, and you're having to sit around the table and figure out that you have to work as a collective. A lot of the NGOs have been doing that for a long time, trying to figure out how, if you do not have direct line authority over people, can you get them to do things? Because that's how your infrastructure is working. It's less efficient, it's messier, but it allows CARE to hold together. There's been a general tendency towards more line control for CEOs. As in Interaction, there's a general tendency to give more authority to the executive in Interaction, that this is not about the lowest common denominator in a working group, that we could, in essence, call that and push it a certain way. So we have more authority to sort of push the sector. But to be candid, we sit on top of this as sort of an NGO State Department with the power of suasion and the power of our members' missions. What's interesting in terms of where they are now, the pressure I'm getting is, can you please help accelerate our change process? We need to evolve faster to be able to cope with this changing world. Interaction, can you play a role in that evolution to speed us up? Some of us are going to go out of business. Your role is not to look at those who are in trouble, but rather how do you accelerate change for the broadest number possible? And can you create tools for us to do that, because the future is going to be more collaboration rather than less collaboration. So we need to figure out mechanisms to do that. And can you experiment with that? And by the way, we'll do that outside. The only way that Interaction functions in this space is by not claiming blind authority. If we claimed, I am the representative of the NGO sector, well, who are you and what are the dynamics to do this, which is very different than saying, we have an opportunity to influence someone X, can we get a position together? And yes, there's an opportunity to be at the summit with so-and-so, with heads of state. Neil Kennegar is head of Mercy Corps. Do you want to represent Interaction, wear an Interaction hat and do that? And here are the requirements of wearing that Interaction hat. And if you do this year after year, you eventually build a cadre of diplomats, if you want to call them that, who are playing that role beyond their individual organization. But to the strength of entropy, I should say, pulling us all into myriad little pieces. The thing that pulls it back is the recognition that a small little care project or a small little Save the Children project isn't going to change much. You need to go to scale. To go to scale, you need multiple actors. To do that, you need to partner and to coordinate with each other. And here is a tool that you have in your toolbox called Interaction to help you do that.
Last question.
Okay. This is the one that I was going to ask all along, I guess, and it has to do with, I guess, humanitarian assistance and development. I mean, I worked on the USAID food assistance programs, but more on the development side for quite a while. And there has been such a tremendous change, which to some extent you've alluded to. Organizations that started out focusing on humanitarian assistance had a certain view of their clients, and somewhere along the line came along the fact that these people are business people and that maybe you can work with them a little bit more through the private sector. And I hear you talking about values. Anyway, I'd like to know a little bit more. Are those two things really interacting, or are there still tensions between the people who come in with a more humanitarian assistance point of view and those that are working more, what I guess I would call development? And are there problems in the short term, but there's also issues in the long term? You alluded to thinking perhaps in a recovery program that you can look at, spread the resources over a longer period of time, the whole issue of building back better. Anyway, I'd like to hear a little bit more on that, which to me is...
So there's a bit of generational stuff going on and also a change of leadership. The generational bit is the millennials are coming in and they're not saying, I'm doing good by working through nonprofits. Give me the tool, for profit or nonprofit, I want to do some social good. So there's not the sort of 1960s legacy of which side of that divider you want. At the leadership level, I remember sitting around a table, a group of CEOs, we had 20 different tables, 7 or 8 people per table sitting there. First person said, well, I'm sort of different, I'm coming from the private sector, here's my background, I'm now CEO of Interaction Member X. By the 5th person at that table saying I'm coming from the private sector, they were no longer talking about them somehow being different. The leadership of the sector comes from everywhere. I am odd in that I have done my entire career in the NGO sector. Carolyn Wu, Dean at Notre Dame, Dave Miliband, Foreign Secretary of the UK, Michelle Nunn, a politician running for the Senate. Those are just some of the larger ones. It is rare to find an NGO person in leadership who's actually had their career as an NGO. There's an incredible mixture of leadership. There's a group in the middle, sort of caught there going, oh my goodness, the world has changed under our feet. Let's not get too close to corporations. Let's do this. There's a value set that still plays throughout this. The biggest barriers, so that's sort of an institutional bit, the biggest barriers tend to be the sectors people are trained in. So people are trained as humanitarians, and there are 1,000 people in Save the Children who are humanitarians, and then there's another group over here of 1,000 people who all their work is working with the private sector and business value chains. There's as much difference within Save the Children right there, just because of the types of individuals that are happening. But what's happening is individuals from these different sectors are rubbing shoulders with each other much more than they were in the past. And it's very difficult to do your job as a humanitarian without at some point talking to the individual whose job it is to relate to the private sector and vice versa. It makes things less pure, but at the same time reflects an evolution of the concept of positive social change as not something simply owned by non-state, non-profit actors, but positive social change being a partnership of government, a partnership of the private sector, and all the tensions that exist within a corporation as they wrestle with that and how do you champion it and so forth. And at the same time, knowing when to say no, because this is simply somewhere we don't go. It's that messy world of NGO diplomacy that we find ourselves in. So, thank you.
Sam, thank you very, very much for this. I think it's been extraordinary for us all, even those of us who occasionally have worked with NGOs, to learn as much as we have today about the changing nature of the work and its influence on aid and on the world at large. So thank you very, very much for taking all this time, an hour and a half of standing here, and simply you can tell from the kind of questions that people had that it was just an opportunity to learn about something that was not very well known, and even if we thought we knew, we learned that we didn't know. So, thank you.